Yes, so my name's Laura Green. I have worked on lameness and foot rot in sheep for about 20 years. I have done a few other bits and pieces as well, but this is the area that I've spent most of my time working, and a huge number of people have been involved in this work, both researchers and, really importantly, farmers. And if any of you have filled in one of our questionnaires or participated in one of our other studies, thank you very much. And if you haven't, you might even in the future get a questionnaire from us. And it's really helpful if you fill those in, because we use the work that you as farmers are doing to understand how best we can manage lameness in sheep. So what I'm going to do tonight is take 20 to 25 minutes to go through a background on lameness in sheep and management that we've identified as the best way of controlling lameness. Please do send those questions in, because if there's something that you're interested in knowing more about, someone else will be too, or if you think I'm wrong about something, someone else will too. And it's a real opportunity for us to discuss and debate these things. So please do get the questions coming in. So we're going to look at why lameness is important. I'm sure you're very aware of that already. What we see as the common causes of foot lameness, we're particularly looking at foot lameness today. Practices that have come through as effective through the research that we've done and through observations we've done on commercial farms, and some of the benefits that we have seen from farms where lameness is under control. And as Laura said, it's a real success story. We've got about a third of the flocks in the countries of Great Britain with less than 2% lame sheep on average. And that's way down on 25 years ago, where it was somewhere nearer to 8%. So really good news story. Still a way to go. There are still flocks where levels are higher. And of course, there are always new things coming along. And one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is CODD, which I know is an increasing problem for some farms. So foot lameness. So we've got a picture of a lame sheep. You can see she's lame on one of her front feet, and she's got her hind limbs tucked under and putting more weight onto her hind limb because she's trying to take weight off that painful leg. So that pain does have an effect. Ewes that are lame lose body condition really very quickly within a couple of weeks of being lame. Over a period of time, we see that lame ewes have fewer lambs at birth. More of those lambs are likely to die, and those that have lambs, they go on to grow more slowly, which is probably because the ewes are producing less milk or just unkeen to have a lamb feed from them. And as we know, the consequences are poor welfare for the sheep that are affected, concerns about antibiotic resistance if large amounts of antibiotic are being used, reduced productivity, as I've said, quite a lot of information around farmers who don't feel that they've got lameness under control are in quite a negative emotional state, and very concerned about farmers' mental health at the moment. So it's worth thinking about that. And of course, the purpose of these seminars around improved sustainability. If we can improve management of lameness, reduce early culling of ewes, increase productivity, then sheep farming is a bit more sustainable. And lameness is still very important, and it's on one of the health and welfare pathways for DEFRA in England. So I thought I'd start with a picture of some normal feet. These are normal, but I have to say, you're probably going, I've never seen sheep feet quite like that, unless you happen to live right by the coast. So these are feet from sheep that live in a very sandy environment by the coast in West Wales. But they're nice pictures to show you, because there are a couple of things you can see. If you look at the left-hand picture, you see a very short toe. That's because they're on quite hard ground. But even in these feet, which are short, you can just see that the wall around the sole is more prominent than the sole itself. So this wall bit here, than the sole area here. And that's because when sheep walk, the first thing that hits the ground is the wall, and they weight bear on the wall. And you need to think of the sole as a bit like a trampoline. It's the bit that goes up and down. It's a spongy bit. So we don't want sheep with feet that have been trimmed such that they're walking on the sole of the feet. We want them to be weight bearing on the wall on the outside. And I'll show you a bit more later, but the length of the toe is really about whether the ground is hard or soft. And for this sheep, the ground is very hard and sandy, so the feet are quite worn away. And the other nice thing in this picture on the right is this really dry interdigital skin, which is dry and hairy. Both those things tend to go away as soon as we start to see scald or strip, which are the first signs of foot rot. So that's, anyway, that's what we're aiming for, a normal foot like that. But as I've said, they can be overgrown. So you might think, well, this looks like a really cruddy foot compared with the last one. But actually, this foot is fine as well. If it comes from a sheep that's on wet pasture, long wet pasture with soft ground, the toes grow longer, the wall horn can overwear. As soon as that ground becomes harder, this excess horn will be worn off. It'll shear off at the foot, and the toes may well get shorter. And we did a study where we looked at ewes over 10 months in the west of England, so a very wet area. And on the right-hand side of this graph, slide, you can see this graph. And this is the shape of overgrowth of the wall horn over a period from autumn through to summer of 10 months. And what it shows us is that this is each of those lines is one of the claws of the 4 feet of the sheep. And basically the horn starts long, it goes short through the cold, hard ground of the winter, grows longer again as we go through to summer and it's warm and wet on the ground, and starts to wear away again as we get through to the drier, hotter summer weather, which even in Bristol, we managed to get some slightly harder ground and less rain in the summer. So the message really is that horn it's a very, very flexible tissue, and it will change its shape depending on the time of year. And we've had a lot of focus over many years on trimming away horn. Over the year, horn grows about 10 centimeters or about 4 inches. So we never trim it away when we're trimming. We just sometimes trim it and sometimes don't. And what we've seen is if you stop trimming the feet, they naturally wear away, and you will have periods of time when they're longer and periods of time when they're shorter, depending on these ground conditions. So that's a normal foot. What I'm going to do now is talk through the common causes that we see in foot lameness. So scald, strip, foot rot, all one condition. Scald, strip, the posh name is interdigital dermatitis. It's a bit of a mouthful. I'll say scald from now on. And then foot rot, where we see underrunning of the foot, but all caused by the same bacteria, which I'll talk about in a moment. Cod, which I will talk on further. And then I'll briefly touch on white line disease or shelly hoof, foot abscesses and granulomas. So as I said, scald and foot rot are all one disease. They are a progression from a mild form of the disease to a more serious form. It's caused by this bacteria, Dichelobacter nodosus. Fantastic bacteria, really complicated, and it has learnt to live with sheep. So it lives on the foot of sheep with foot rot. That's the only place it lives. It is spread by going onto the ground, onto another foot, but it can't live on the ground. It dies within a matter of hours to days, depending on the ground conditions. And it's our wet ground that allows the spread between sheep of this organism. And so, as I say, it causes both scald and strip. One thing we've noticed is that in our studies, farmers have tended to call any damage to the foot rot, so any damage to the horny part of the foot. And one thing to be particularly aware of is cod, which looks quite similar. What I've done tonight is I've put together lots of pictures, because I think we rely very much on visually being able to differentiate these diseases, and it's not easy to do so. So I'm hoping the pictures will, show you that what you already know, which is they're difficult to differentiate, but to think about if you've got what you thought was foot rot and it's really not something you're getting under control with, that it could be cod. So we will have a look at some pictures and look through the different presentations that we can see of the condition. So starting with scald, the big green circle is the hint. So inside this particular image, this is the skin between the 2 claws. So we have a claw to the top on both sides, the skin between the claws. And as you can see, it looks moist, a little bit pinky blue, a little bit bubbly white, and the hair is missing. And that's a very typical sign of scald or strip. Another one here, same position for the feet. And we're starting to see that the hair has gone, and in fact the top of the skin has worn away. And that's the really risky bit, because the skin that's worn away there is hooching with bacteria. That's gone onto the ground, and that's what another sheep can stand on and pick up the infection from this wearing away of the skin in the foot. So this is a different presentation again. The feet are now facing the other way. But I wanted to show this because this is also a very common way we see foot rot. So this again, this grey shiny area here is the skin. The hair is looking sparse and sticky, but it doesn't look bloody at all. It looks very almost like unbloody, and it's rotting, and that's why we get that really classic rotting smell with foot rot. So you can see pink, you can see white, it can go as far as a grey look to the skin. Now in this picture, similar again, we've got some swelling and some pinkness, but starting to see the horn is not looking right, and there's the stickiness around the horn just as it joins the skin between the feet. That will be very smelly, and if you rubbed your thumb along it, you'd come off with a sort of a crusty, gungy bit, and that's showing that the bacteria is starting to get underneath the horn and separate the horn from the live part of the foot. Similar here, we've got a bit more blood, but the same sort of damage is occurring. Again, got similar here. This is more invasive, more of the horn. We can see swelling of the skin above it. Again, so that's more of foot rot. And then these final stages you might see where if you look at the foot and just move the skin, in fact, you'll find that the sole isn't joined to the bottom of the foot at all, and it's come away, and we've got a lesion that's really big and nasty at the bottom of the foot. And finally, all the sole can go away. So we've gone right the way from the sort of the mildest lesions to the most severe lesions in foot rot. They are all foot rot, all can be managed and treated in the same way. Moving on to contagious ovine digital dermatitis, COD, thought to be caused by these treponeme organisms. The big difference between foot rot and COD is you typically see the lesions on the top of the outside of the foot. So they start where the hair joins the wall horn at the top of the foot, as opposed to inside on the skin that we see with foot rot. But one of the challenges, of course, we don't always see the start of the lesions. So it can look similar. So some pictures here. So this is the top of the toe, and we can see this swelling, and usually it's a very bloody lesion as well. If you touch it, it's very painful for the sheep and very bloody. This is more advanced, and you can see a much bigger lesion going across both toes in the skin, but also ulcers on both of the top of the horn of the toes there. And in this one, to show you, those of you who've seen CODD and have it in your flock, you will find sheep where the whole horn capsule comes away, and that's what's starting to occur in this sheep here. So typically there's more swelling and there's more blood, and it's very painful when we see COD. An even more severe example here, but really just to point out, it does look quite similar to foot rot, and it's important to bear in mind how similar they are. And unfortunately, it will also have the smell of foot rot, because typically when you get a COD lesion, that bacteria from the foot rot will invade as well, and you'll have both things going on at the same time. So really unpleasant lesions. So I'll talk about how we manage those when I'm just going to briefly touch on the other causes of lameness. So white line disease, usually we call it shelly hoof. Normally there isn't a smell, and normally you will see, what we see is separation of the sole horn from the wall horn. So you'll get a gap, as we can see in these pictures at the bottom here. Quite often sheep aren't lame with it, and it will just sort itself out, doesn't need trimming. But you can get lameness if stones or grass or something sharp gets into the gap between the horn and the rest of the foot and causes an abscess. We don't know a lot about why it occurs. We've done a study recently where we found it was more likely in flocks where farmers are foot trimming, and I think that's because when you trim, you leave the foot and it regrows slightly abnormally, and so that might be what we're seeing. Formalin foot bath, interesting, was linked to white line disease, and formalin does damage growth. So it may be that as the horn is growing, it's being damaged by the formalin, and so you get the separation. We also saw it was linked to lower stocking densities, which typically are poorer pastures. And anecdotally, from some of the studies we've done, we've seen white line disease occur in flocks when they've when it's rained a lot, and they've then been standing in really boggy, wet ground for a while. We see that the amount of white line disease goes up. So the challenge, as I say, is when you get an abscess forming, and you can see in this picture on the left, we've got a swelling on the foot, and in the picture on the right, it's broken out at the top. They will respond to an antibiotic injection if you get that swelling, and it's worth draining the foot if it's not open. So the last one I wanted to touch on was granulomas. So we often call these strawberries, and in each of these lesion pictures you can see a red fleshy lesion, very, very painful, swollen, and it's the sheep foot response to some sort of damage. So we see it in foot rot that hasn't been treated, in CODD that's been treated late and doesn't respond very well. Also see it in sheep if they've been trimmed and the trims cut through to blood, and you then get a swelling where the vessels were damaged. And again, in studies, we've seen it more commonly in flocks where routine foot trimming and routine foot bathing are being done. I mean, one of the messages from tonight is actually, by and large, try and leave feet alone. And a lot of these white line disease and granulomas will go away. Or the granulomas won't go away, unfortunately. They won't come in the first place. They are very difficult to treat. And as I said earlier, we talk about each of these diseases separately, but mixed situations are very common. So you will often get cod and foot rot, or foot rot and a granuloma. And so just be aware that when you're looking at feet, that it's not as easy and it's just this one condition. That it is quite difficult when we look at feet to see what's going on. So what we've done in terms of our research, we've done large surveys, which are these questionnaires that we send through the post to, our biggest one went to 4,000 farmers, but we do smaller ones at different points. We ask a lot of questions, and from those questions, we gather patterns of what's going on. And we can then use those patterns to take forward into other studies. So we might then go on to do a clinical trial to investigate if we do or stop doing something, what the impact is on the sheep. And I'll be talking about one of those in a moment. And sometimes we do a study where we monitor the same sheep over time, and we don't do anything to the sheep, but by looking at how things change and the situation that's sheep in, we start to understand better the progression of a disease, for example. And we combine those studies on farms with taking samples, taking those into the lab, and doing lab investigations of which bacteria are there, how many are there, what strain they are. And then we do put all of that together in terms of a big spreadsheet, and we analyse the data. So that's basically sort of nuts and bolts of the research that we do. And we work very much with commercial farmers. So we will have worked with somewhere between, I don't know, about 5,000 farmers over the years that we've worked on lameness in sheep. And we've done a couple of studies working with a clinical psychologist on understanding motivation and belief around managing lameness, which has been quite helpful, I hope. So as I said at the start, many flocks have got less than 2% lame sheep, and a lot of farmers are following some of the recommended practices. But we do still have farms with somewhere between sort of more than 2 and at certain times more than 15+% lame sheep. And on average, they're less likely to be following the recommended practices. So what are flocks doing, or what are farmers doing with flocks with low levels of lameness? So the absolute critical message is to treat lame sheep as soon as they become lame. Ideally, that would be within the day. But what we see is the best effects are farmers who are able to treat within 3 days. And quite often what we've discussed with farmers is if you can look at a third of your flock with the intention to treat it that day, then you start to get lameness under control. And of course, what happens is you start to look at groups of sheep and none of them are lame, so no treatment is required. Separating lame sheep out at treatment from the main group, so having them in a separate group, because this infection persists for maybe a day or two after treatment. So those sheep continue to be infectious to the rest of the flock. Can't always be done. I know sometimes it's very difficult at certain times of year or certain situations, but where farmers can do it, and even if they only do it sometimes, there is definite benefit to doing that. And then culling sheep that become lame with foot rot or CODD more than once in a year. So if they're lame twice or more, to cull them. And the reason for that is those sheep are particularly susceptible and they act as a source of infection to the rest of the flock. So by culling them, you not only remove them, but you probably reduce the number of other sheep that will become lame. And certainly we've seen in our studies some sheep get treated 7 times in a year. And so they take a lot of effort and they cost an awful lot. So that rigorous removal is worth it. And it's not many sheep. So it may be 3 to 5% of sheep in the first year, but it's typically less than 1% of sheep. And of course, what you can always do is separate them if you don't want to cull them, and then decide whether to cull them later. But even keeping them separate from the rest of the flock is a really beneficial way of preventing spread of disease within the flock. At a flock level, what we see is farms who are selecting replacements from ewes that are never lame have really great success, because those are the ewes that are most resistant. And so, of course, you're selecting offspring that are very resistant. And what we're just seeing, particularly in these flocks that have got to a certain level of control with lameness, that if they are practicing strong quarantine, so sheep that are new or returning to the farm are quarantined for 3 weeks or more, we're seeing lower levels of lameness in those flocks. And that's because these sheep are not bringing in new strains. Even if you've got foot rot and CODD, sheep will bring in new strains and create new issues. So quarantine is a really effective thing to do. And then there's a role for vaccination. So the vaccine is not brilliant, but for farmers that have more than 5% foot rot, it can be part of the process of getting management under control. It will reduce the amount of treatments required by somewhere between 20 and 40%. And that means less catching of sheep and more ability to get under and get control of what's going on with vaccination. And there are the odd group of farmers that say vaccine doesn't work, but other farmers are also very in favour of it. So it's certainly worth thinking about something to do. The good news is, I think, that our work has shown there are things that are worth not doing. So not practicing routine foot trimming. So 15 years ago, 20 years ago, good farmers turned all their sheep over and trimmed the feet twice a year. And what we see is that's linked to higher levels of lameness. And that's because when you're trimming, it's very easy to over trim and draw blood. And when you draw blood, you end up with more lameness. Sheep are actually lame because it's like if you cut your own fingernail too short, that's what it hurts. So they're limping. And it takes quite a long time to recover. So no routine foot trimming at all. And actually, I'll show you another slide next. No trimming when we're treating lame sheep either. And farms that don't use foot baths also have the lowest level of lameness. It is not an effective treatment to treat foot rot. So once you've got any horn damage at all, it doesn't work. It is an effective treatment to treat if you've got a large group of ewes and small lambs with scald. The foot bath will definitely help to dampen it down. But actually, if you get control of lameness in your adults, you won't get that scald outbreak in the lambs in most years. This is a tricky disease. I'm not saying this is something that you can do all this and stop. This is ongoing stuff that needs to be done year on year or day on day. And we also find that farmers who only cull ewes once they're permanently lame have the highest level of lameness. So don't wait. That should have a wait in there. Do not wait until culls ewes are permanently lame. And that's, as I said before, because they are the source of infection to other sheep in the flock. So treatments, I've held back on treatment to try and keep your attention. So there is a good treatment to use. There's a very, very effective treatment, and it is also well within the scope of the antimicrobial resistance guidelines. So if we're thinking about foot rot without any involvement of cod, one intravascular injection of oxytetracycline will lead to recovery of sheep that have got scald or foot rot, and 95+% will recover within 5 days or 10 days, and they won't need another treatment. If we're talking about cod, 2 doses are required, and amoxicillin is the best antibiotic in that situation. And again, that leads to very high levels of recovery. In addition to that, it's really important not to trim the horn on the foot. As I said before, it's painful, and the sheep are actually lame because we've taken the protective horny covering away. So I guess if we think about it, if we went to the doctor because we've got an ulcer on our toe and we had that treated, and then the doctor said, right, now walk home without your shoes on, this is what we are doing to sheep if we trim the horn. So leaving the horn allows that protection to happen. The infection isn't in the horn, it's in the living tissue underneath, and the antibiotic can get to that living tissue and can kill off the infection. And what you see is quite remarkable. When you treat these sheep, a couple of days later, it almost looks like the horn has reattached, and that's because the swelling in the foot's gone down and the horn has gone back to its rightful place. So it can look loose and it can look like it's hanging off, but it's still doing a good job. What I say, if you're itching to trim the horn away, is don't do it at the time you treat the sheep. Look a couple of weeks later, and if you really think that there's something you want to trim away, you could. But again, it's like your fingernails. The bit you trim should be beyond the end of the foot, beyond the end of nothing that is living. So in the slide that I put here, there's a couple of things. So the picture on the left is a photograph I took from a farmer who showed me how he'd been trimming the feet of a sheep that had what he said was foot rot that didn't respond to treatment. And if you can see, the horn has actually been trimmed away completely from the whole of the toe on one side. It's going to take about 3 months for that horn to grow back down to the toe again. And that sheep is lame because all of the tissue here is living tissue. And so that's now hitting whatever the sheep is walking on. And so that's very painful. So an extreme example, but why we don't want trimming to be done. And on the right hand side, this is a little trial we did where we split sheep with foot rot. They were all 1 year old, and a similar breed, and they had 4 different types of treatment. One had just an antibiotic injection, one we just sprayed the foot, another group we injected them, and we also trimmed the foot and sprayed, and the last group we trimmed and sprayed. Sorry, I've got a bit of my screen missing, but the top one had the foot spray as well. And what we can see is the sheep that were given an antibiotic injection, this long-acting oxytetracycline, by 5 days, 70% of them had recovered. If we just sprayed, about 40% of them recovered. If we gave the injection but also trimmed the foot, only 30% of them recovered. And if we just trimmed and sprayed without an injection, only 10% of them had recovered. Push forward another 5 days, and as I said before, virtually all of those given the injection and the spray have recovered, and we were still at well under 50% of those that have been trimmed have recovered. And I think it's because we're causing a different sort of pain from the trimming. What we also see is those sheep that are trimmed are more likely to get foot rot again, and I think that's because the foot becomes abnormally shaped and it's more likely to retain the infection. So quite compelling argument for not trimming. And I was brought up to trim feet, and it has taken me an awfully long time not to look at a misshapen, cruddy looking foot and thinking I really should trim it. And I think I saw someone trimming some feet so badly that it actually convinced me why it was that we say don't do it. And I really would say don't do it. So what are the benefits of using this approach? Well, we ran a trial where we stopped trimming and we started injecting sheep within 3 days. And within 6 weeks, we had, in the group where we were running this treatment, we'd gone from an average of 8% sheep lame to an average of 2%. So in 6 weeks, you can start to really get on top of how much lameness is occurring. We didn't do any separation in that. So if you're also able to separate out the lame sheep, I think the benefits can be faster. It can take a bit longer than that, but we're not talking about years. We are talking about weeks to a few months to get into a much better situation. Our studies on farmers' beliefs and attitudes is farmers who have control of lameness feel confident about the situation that they're in and positive about what they're doing. Farmers always say to us that their flock now looks great, and you look at them and you don't have those straggly sheep at the back, the thin sheep, the ones where the coat looks tatty. So it is a real boost to physically how the flock can look. And although when we said to farmers, why aren't you going to treat individual lame sheep, they said because it takes too much time and it costs too much money. When farmers have moved from doing it, we said, what are the benefits of doing it? And they've said it saves us time and it saves us money. So it's one of those barriers to get over, if you like, but actually it's a benefit. And doing the economic calculations we've done, it's definitely a cost-effective thing to treat individuals. So it takes about a week to trim 500 sheep's feet. So if you stop doing that, you get a week of your life back, which you might need to spend a few hours, a few times a week treating lame sheep, but not doing that routine trimming. And as I said before, this is an ongoing thing. So you can save time in managing lameness as you have fewer lame sheep, but those sheep that are lame still need to be treated as a priority. So just to pull together what I've said, most lameness is infectious, so both foot rot and cod are infectious, so we need to think about managing these conditions as infectious diseases. We can get an average of less than 2% sheep lame in flocks with the current knowledge that we have, and more farmers are achieving that. By treating these individuals, we're protecting the rest of the flock. Not routine and therapeutic. So therapeutic is trimming when you've got a lameness problem in the foot. So not doing that and not foot bathing are beneficial to lameness control. Thinking about where to source replacements. So if you're not breeding your own ones and can't select from Never Lame, working with someone who's supplying you with ewes and rams, where you know that they are also managing lameness the way you want it managed. So you know that you're getting ewes and rams from sheep that have been selected against lameness. Having a plan for quarantine and being able to quarantine. And finally, as I say, those farmers that have moved over to using these best practices say that it saves them time and money. So nice to see we've got lots of questions coming in. Just a reflection, you as farmers are the best care for your flock, and you know your flock best. And I've given you lots of averages and lots of messages, and it may be that you're thinking some of those are really quite impossible for your flock. I did 30 visits to different farms, and we talked about this. And with each of the farmers, we sat through and sort of chewed over what they were doing and what they were able to do to work out what was possible for them. So, and I know the situation in Scotland is not the same as many of the flocks I would have worked with in England. But just thinking about it, so for example, if you turn ewes up onto hill land and you can't catch them, then making sure that none of them are lame when they go up means you're not putting infection up onto the hill with all the rest of the flocks. So it's thinking about how can you make it work for you in your situation. And I've said, another example, if you need to purchase replacements, think about where you're getting them from and make sure you have a plan of who you're buying from and you know what their managements are. And that's it. But a huge thank you to lots and lots of people who've been involved in the research, and many, many farmers who've participated in our studies. And on the right-hand side are various people who funded us as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that presentation, Laura. That's been very insightful. A great whistle-top tour around everything to do with sheep lameness. We have a lot of questions coming in, and don't let that put you off putting more in. But just before we go to them, I'd just like to highlight that at the moment, through the Preparing for Sustainable Farming scheme, there is £250 available for getting your vet on farm to help you find out what type of lameness and the prevalence of each of the lameness, and then help develop the 5-point plan tailored to your flock on your farm. So there's £250 available. It is freely available, so make the use of it. So Laura, we have a lot of questions coming through. So we will start with one that's very, very topical at the moment. It has been an incredibly wet back end here in Scotland. So, and you mentioned trying to get the ground to dry up helps with adapting the foot lameness, foot length, should I say. So what should we do if we've been in this very wet spell and the ground just isn't drying? What do we intervene with? Is there anything we can do otherwise to help reduce our lameness risk?
I hope I didn't say dry the ground. I mean, that would be lovely, wouldn't it? We could put sheep back into the Middle East where they came from originally, where it was really dry. I mean, I think it is really difficult. I think you can't dry the ground, and I think every farmer will have as much of a solution as they can to managing sheep in those conditions. And I'm no better than anyone else in thinking about how you would put them on the ground that's least damaging to the ground to have them on, and so on. I think sheep are tough and they have to go through that. I guess the this is more of not a hindsight, but if you think about going forward, if we're going to get more and more of this heavy rain, which I think we are, one of the things that I often find when I've worked with farmers is they'll work very hard with the ewes and lambs up to weaning, and then they go, thank goodness the lambs have been separated, I'll forget about the ewes now until I'm going to put the tup in. And in fact, in that period, that's probably the best period to try and get on top of lameness. So if in that period you could do a lot of your treatments, then at least when you get into this wet weather, you don't have a lot of lame sheep as you're going into it, and so hopefully less spread. I'm not sure how cold it is, and it's a shame people can't be a bit more interactive, but sometimes with foot rot in the autumn in the colder areas of England, we don't see it spreading, we just see the sheep that have got it stay with it. So it's still, I think, a situation of, even if you can't catch the sheep at the moment, once the conditions are better and you can pull out the lame sheep, it's still worth pulling them out and treating them, particularly as they're starting to go into pregnancy. But no, I have no miracles for drying ground out.
I suppose something we're going to have to adapt with over time, and it'll be interesting to see how that influences lameness levels going forward.
Yeah.
So we have got quite a few questions that I'm going to lump together here about, and during your presentation, you mentioned that we should try and avoid trimming wherever possible, but is there at any point where trimming could be acceptable? And specifically looking towards those that have got poor foot conformation, where their feet are maybe a wee bit deformed, rather than just being lame.
Yeah, so I think people will want to trim sheep for shows. What I always say is think of that as a pedicure or a manicure. So you are trimming the outside of the foot to make it look nice. And the really critical thing is not drawing blood. So as long as the trim is in that situation, it's not doing the sheep any harm. And it might, it's going to do some good in that she's going to look, or he's going to look very nice in the show. So, there's that situation. Sometimes you might need to trim if the white line disease that we talked about, where you've got the horn coming away. At the moment, we're still saying the best treatment is to trim the wall horn that sort of popped out, so it's like formed like a half moon shape. But again, there's horn underneath that, so you're not trimming into sensitive tissue. You're just taking away the loose horn where you've got mud or a stone or something like that impacted. So I think that's reasonable. The other times we've talked about it, if you've got, for example, rams that you might be feeding hard and they're on concrete and they're growing quickly, they might need to have their feet trimmed. And yes, if you've got deformities, but what I would say is mark those sheep and make sure you don't breed from them and keep any offspring from them. And if they're really bad and they need trimming often, you might want to think about how long you want to keep them in the flock themselves. But the critical thing with all of them is not to draw blood.
Yeah, I think, yes, that's a very good message there. Is I think we need to wean ourselves off at least trim in that historical. You must trim every sheep.
Basically, you're going to have to take your time, and as soon as you have to take your time, you're not going to want to do it very much because it's back aching already.
And just kind of following on from that, Laura, as well, can foot rot spread between the shears that we're using for trimming?
Well, you won't be using shears for trimming anymore. Probably. We know that we can pick it up in soil. So we've done studies where we've had sheep in a field and we can detect it both on the top of the soil and sort of 2 to 3 inches down. I think it sort of washes down. So if we're doing that, then I'm sure if you trim a sheep with foot rot and then go straight to the next sheep, you could easily be spreading the organism that way. But as I say, that's what you want to stop. So
yeah, that's it. We'll be stopping doing everything now. And in your presentation, you mentioned quarantining sheep for 3 weeks once they've been introduced or returned to your flock. But how long should we quarantine lame sheep for? Is there any particular time?
So this separation, we've never really done a study, but what we can see is if you can see the lesion mending and the sheep is not lame, then she's not infectious. So you're probably looking at 10 days to 2 weeks would be fine. What you have to think about though is, of course, if you've then moved in more lame sheep into that same group, so you might just want to wait until that whole group has sort of settled out for a couple of weeks before you put the whole group back. I mean, obviously nobody wants actually sheep isolated by themselves because sheep don't like that. So, but it's not a long period of time.
Yeah, you could manage it as like a little croc flock, and then those that are repeat offenders are easily identified.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, it goes back to, we talked about the wet conditions that I've never been a sheep farmer, but I do appreciate that it's a lot of work. And the farmers I've worked with who have been most successful, it's because they plan and they stick to plans. So I think it's also about, planning to have somewhere where you can put your lame sheep. So you're not suddenly got 6 lame sheep and nowhere to put them.
Yeah, and I'm just to see, there's quite a few questions here coming in about foot baths. So you mentioned foot bath and kind of linking to shelly hoof and everything, but is there any particular product that's better than others, and where do antibiotic foot baths fit in this mixture as well?
So I think antibiotic foot baths don't fit in at all for sheep. There was a phase where they were being used, particularly for cod, because it looks similar to a condition in cattle, and antibiotic foot baths were being used in cattle. But I think if you look at the antimicrobial resistance guidelines now, there isn't any place for antibiotic foot baths at all. There's no evidence that one product is better than another for foot bathing. What you have to think about, what is foot bathing doing? It's disinfecting the outside of the foot. So it's like us washing our hands. So, and I think that's why it can be helpful with scalds, because that's very superficial, a very surface infection. And so you can disinfect the skin of the feet, and it will help to dampen down infection. I was quite surprised with the study we did. Formalin actually comes out really quite badly, in that we see it linked to more white line disease, more granulomas. In some countries, it's also, of course, banned because of the risk to human health. So I would say, if you're going to use formalin, be very careful and don't have it at the low concentrations. Don't have it at high concentrations. I mean, it's caustic if you have it at high concentrations as well. And the few studies we've done, people have used zinc, copper, various products. Sheep tend to only go through them fairly quickly. So I've always said, actually, you could probably use tea tree oil and fairy liquid, and you've got a disinfectant there, and the fairy liquid helps it all to stick. But my big message would be to ask yourself why you're foot bathing. There's some published papers recently showing that the bacteria does survive in the foot bath. And a lot of foot baths for sheep are not as clean, and they're not emptied out, and so on. So you could actually just be spreading infection between sheep, particularly if you're putting lame sheep through the foot bath with your healthy sheep. So I think what I would like to see is that we just stop foot bathing.
Yes, so foot bathing and foot trimming are both out now. So, and Laura, you mentioned there about antimicrobial resistance, and obviously that's such a growing issue as well. But one of the key treatments you mentioned there was using antibiotic injections and sprays there.
Yeah.
So we obviously try to reduce our antibiotic use as much as possible, but use it where it's required. So would you just inject the visibly lame sheep, or should you actually go around all the sheep to see those are not showing any signs of lameness, but might be in those early stages of scald that you showed us the pictures of?
All of our work, we've just treated the lame sheep, and I think if you turn over every sheep and look for a lesion, you could end up treating 60 or 70% of your sheep, and that will use an awful lot of antibiotics. And I think you have to ask what the benefits are. So if you were going to go towards eradicating foot rot, which is very, very difficult to do, then there may be an argument for doing inspections of all feet, doing a treatment, doing inspections of all the feet again, treating any that are still lame, and then culling them. That's what they do in Australia. The reason it works, and only actually in some parts of Australia, and the reason it works there is they do this in a period where the ground is hard and dry and hot, and there's no spread of disease. And I think we got rather confused sort of 20, 30 years ago, thinking that's what we were aiming to do with foot rot. And I think we have to live with it. And I think what we have to do is control it, not try and eradicate it from flocks. So we treat the lame sheep, and as I said, I guess the benefits are to the sheep itself. So by treating it quickly, it doesn't lose condition. We don't see the loss in lambs, born, died, growth rate. So it goes from being a poor old miserable sheep that's lame for a long period of time that looks a bit grotty, to it's lame, it's treated, it's not lame. So it's sort of a very quick process. By treating within 3 days, what you find is fewer sheep become lame, and so you're using less antibiotics. So the worst thing you can do is to start saying, oh yeah, Laura Green said use antibiotic injection and spray, and then go out every 2 or 3 weeks and treat all the lame sheep, because the spread will have happened in that time, and you will have as many lame sheep as you've ever had, and you'll be using lots of antibiotics for months and months and months. So it has to be that combination of the time and the right treatment. And I do think it is, at the moment, it is right that we use antibiotics. It's a bacterial disease. And the 2 antibiotics that I've recommended are both really low down on the risk spectrum in terms of risk to human health. They're not antibiotics that are typically used. often in people, and certainly not in hospitals and in life-threatening situations. They're very standard antibiotics, but they work. We don't need strong ones, we don't need new ones. We can just use these antibiotics we've been using for a long time.
That's a very good message there, Laura. And you didn't really touch on this, I don't think, through your presentation, but there is a vaccine available for helping with some of the lameness. So how frequently do you need to vaccinate, and when should you vaccinate?
So that's quite a complicated question. So the vaccine lasts somewhere around 4 to 6 months. The guidelines are complex. So you mentioned the £250 available to get the veterinary advice. So definitely, if you're not using the vaccine, relive this conversation with your vet, because it's quite complex. So in theory, you need a first dose and a second dose, as you do with a lot of vaccines, and they would be within 1 year, within a few weeks in the same year. And then a lot of farmers will then vaccinate once a year, and target the period where they are at greatest risk. So for some farmers, they see more foot rot in their flock if they house in the winter, so they may vaccinate in the autumn. Others see the greatest risk in the spring, and so they'll vaccinate in the spring. The vaccine, as I said, it's not 100% effective, and what we actually find is some ewes don't respond to it at all, and they're probably the same ewes that get repeatedly lame. But it dampens everything down a bit. So if you sort of want to use the vaccine as well as doing the treatments, then it's all part of good management. But vaccine and then doing nothing, you'll also, you'll still have quite a lot of lame sheep. There was a discussion at one point about using it twice a year, as I said, because it lasts for about 6 months. But I very, very few farmers I'm aware of are doing that.
Yes, and just continuing on the vaccine, what about vaccination in late pregnancy? Does the lowered immune system of the ewes make any difference? And how does that then influence on her lambs? Does it pass through the colostrum or across the placenta, those antibodies?
There's no evidence that it works less effectively in late pregnancy, but I think what you need to think about is what other vaccines you're going to be giving at that time. And it is a vaccine that you want to give not when you're giving other vaccines. So it tends to be latter end of mid-pregnancy that people will vaccinate if they're vaccinating pregnant ewes. I don't think there's any studies to know whether protection is passed on to lambs, whether there's protection. Lambs don't tend to get scald or foot rot for the first few weeks, which would suggest there's some protection going on. But in studies we've done, we caught some lambs before they hit the ground and swabbed their feet, and they didn't have any of this bacteria. And 12 hours later, we went back and swabbed their feet, and they did. So they're picking the bacteria up really early on. But it's important to remember that it's not every time they pick the bacteria up they will get lame. And that's part of the challenge of who do you treat, and why we stick to just treating lame sheep.
Yeah, and following on to that, we're going back to our quarantine when we were discussing going back to removing these lame sheep. So if you've got a ewe that's lame, should you automatically quarantine her lambs as well?
I would. I mean, obviously, if it's better for them if they stay with their mum, if you can do it. I appreciate it's really challenging sometimes to find the lamb or lambs and the ewe. We also have work where we see that if a ewe gets lame, her lambs are likely to get lame, and actually as the lambs get bigger, if the lamb gets lame, they're likely to make the ewe lame. So and we think it's because they stand close to each other. So this fact that the organism spreads between feet, if you imagine how ewes and lambs stand together, you can imagine how they stand in each other's footprints. So if the lambs aren't lame and the ewe is, they probably are going to be. And if the lamb's lame, then the ewe's probably going to be lame. So you might as well quarantine or separate out and take all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're almost coming to time, but we've still got quite a few questions. So I think we'll continue on for a few moments yet, because I want to get through as many of these questions as possible.
Yeah.
They're very good questions. So we've had a couple here about, does lime help at all with reducing lameness risk through its drying effects and changing the pH?
So the answer is it should. I don't think there's any evidence to say that it does. I think particular areas to think about that would be if you've got areas where you're feeding the sheep, and particularly if it's onto concrete, so you could actually put it onto dry concrete, and so it can cake the feet as well. But as I say, there's no evidence that it does. But I know it's recommended. Maybe someone's got some experience of it.
Yes, and going back to the vaccination here, Laura, again, do you just do the vaccine for a couple of years, get on top of your lameness, or is it something you need to keep on top of year after year, even if your lameness levels have come to a suitable threshold for your flock?
I think it's always a very difficult question, this, isn't it? And I think the challenge would be thinking about, well, if you stop, then it may well be that the amount of treatment that you're having to do may go up again. So if the vaccine's actually been working, it is still working. So there's no long-term effect from the vaccination. It's part of your program of control. The studies we've done initially, farmers who were using the vaccine for more than 5 years had the most benefit. The more recent work we've done, it's been sort of 2 years and longer, but it takes a while to have an effect. So my hunch is if it's working for you, I would keep going. It's not desperate though, because you could always not do it and see. And if in a few months' time you've got more lameness, you could vaccinate again. So it's something that you can decide and try out. Lots of these things you can try out. You can try not trimming and see what you think. You know, it's not the end of the world to say, I'll try for a few months, and if I decide I don't like it, I'll start again.
Yeah, that's it. There's the cost benefit analysis to all these things,
Yeah.
and that will vary from flock to flock depending on their starting prevalence and where they want to go. Absolutely. As well. So kind of touching on like the 5-point plan that there is for lameness, which one would you say should be the starting point, and do you need to do all 5 points? Are there cumulative effects? So is it you do one, does it add on to the next? So there's a stacking effect on your improvement towards your lameness?
Yes, it's a very good question. I don't particularly talk about the 5-point plan because, in fact, it's about a 25-point plan when you look at everything that's recommended. There's absolutely no doubt that the in the short term, the thing that works most effectively is that rapid treatment. We've both got evidence that it's highly effective. And in one of our studies, we had the same farmers answer a questionnaire for 3 years. And in the 3rd year, some of the farmers who had been doing individual treatments had stopped and their levels of lameness had gone up. So in terms of cost benefit, that is the best thing that you can do. And if you do it well, that's all you need to do. So you don't need to vaccinate. But you have to be able to do this catch and treat within 3 days. And it then comes down to, well, if that's difficult, what are the other things that you can do, which means you're catching fewer sheep? And that would then mean, vaccination will help with that. Culling ewes that have been lame twice or more will help with that. Selecting replacements from these never lame ewes is really good. So there's a real difference. So if you colour ewe, what you're doing is you're taking away a source of infection. If you bring replacements in from ewes that have never been lame, those lambs are less likely to become lame. So you're moving away from doing treatments to not having to treat in the first place. And each of these add on. The ones that are less evidence-based would be, for example, the ones about Lyme. When do you use Lyme? So I would say really focus on the big ones. I guess the other one is not trimming. So in flocks that trim and some of the sheep bleed, 1/3 of the lameness is being caused by trimming. So imagine that. Imagine you can just take away 1/3 of the lameness. That'd be brilliant, wouldn't it? And they don't need an antibiotic. You just need to not trim and you won't get that lame sheep in the first place. So there's some really big wins.
Yeah, so ultimately, I suppose it comes down to having very good record keeping as well, keeping note of which sheep are lame.
That is very helpful. Yeah, yeah. And farmers who've told us they remember their ewes, I'm afraid once you've got more than just a few, it's not very easy to remember them. So some permanent marking is a good idea to know the sheep that's been lame and you've treated.
Yeah, that's it. It can come in any form of this record keeping. It can be your basic pen and paper, or just it goes right through the advanced using these livestock record keeping softwares, or as plain and simple as just putting a permanent raddle mark on these sheep.
Yeah, one of the farmers I worked with early on just did a permanent mark, and he bought in sheep, and he just said every year I just accept that even if I bought them this year, some of them will go this year because they've been lame 2 or 3 times. It's also, I don't know if you have members of the public who spot lame sheep. They do that in some areas as a pastime, but actually putting a dot at the top of the leg that's lame is it's a good way of saying to people, or if they phone you up and say, I've seen a lame sheep in your flock, and say, has it got a dot on it? That tells you I've already marked it. So it is getting better, and that's quite a good message to get out as well.
Yeah, it's sometimes the simplest things can be the easiest tools on farms, and overcomplicate things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one question here we've got, Laura, is there any evidence of any particular breeds being more susceptible or resistant to the different causes of lameness?
There isn't a lot to say one breed is better than another. What we do know within breeds is that some strains or lines are more susceptible than others. And so quite often if you go to a farm with 2 breeds of sheep, the farmer will say breed X has much more lameness than breed Y, but you go to another farm and they'll have the other way around. And I think that's about this point I was saying about how you select replacements. So you can move both those breeds towards being much more resilient and not getting foot rot through both either selecting yourself if you're home breeding or working with whoever you're buying from to select the best resistant sheep for you as well. So no, and absolutely I wouldn't say change your flock. If you're changing your flock, you need to do all the other management practices, and that's an expensive thing to do when you can just do the management practices.
That's it. And what influence does nutrition have on lameness, Laura?
So, I mean, any sheep that's not being fed enough is going to be more susceptible to any disease. So they all need adequate nutrition. I would then say once they've got adequate nutrition, if you treat them quickly, they then won't go backwards and you won't get these poor body condition sheep. So I would say most sheep in poor body condition are in poor body condition because they've been lame, in a flock where all the other sheep are fine, rather than the other way around. So it is an infectious disease, and that does mean that very well fed sheep can become lame.
Yeah, and is there any role for zinc or any of these other trace elements in that?
Not a lot, no. I think it's very easy to think this is going to cure everything. It's always worth working with your vet and looking at trace elements, and if you know you've got any trace element problem on the farm, but that's going to affect the whole sheep, so that's going to be all around whole body deficiencies. But zinc itself isn't going to prevent foot rot.
Yeah. So if there's any more questions, do pop them in, but I think we're kind of coming through most of them just now. Oh, we've got ones here. I've just noticing. What about tups in particular? Because we've spoken about on ewes and lambs, but is there anything specific about tups, especially for bringing in cod?
Well, anything can bring in cod. So if someone on the call has been looking at the pictures of cod that I showed earlier and they don't recognise it, great. The way to keep it out is by not introducing it either through replacement ewes or replacement rams. So it's, you know, it's not linked to one or the other. I guess more people are more likely to buy rams even if they're breeding their own ewes. Really important to know who you're buying from. We've talked about the 3-week quarantine, which works for foot rot. I don't think that works for cod. I remember talking to a farmer down in Kent who bought in about 100 replacement ewes, kept them separate for 8 months, and they went down with cod. Fortunately, before he'd put them in with his very, very large ewe flock. So it doesn't behave itself the way foot rot does. So I can only say you need to know the source that you're buying from and buy from flocks that don't have it.
Yes, so I think that's kind of all the questions tonight. So thank you very much for that, Laura. That's been a fantastic roundup of all things lameness. And I think the key messages that everyone should take home from tonight is put away those foot trim and shears. You don't need them anymore. Reconsider your foot bathing. Really quarantine your flock. Improve your record keeping for any lame sheep. And use the PSF funding to get your vet on farm to get a good insight as to what the lameness story is on your farm and provide a tailored treatment plan.
I was going to say, work out how you can catch those sheep.
Yeah.
About 50% of farmers say it's easy to catch sheep, and about 50% say it's really difficult. So there is a way. It's about working out for your own situation how you can catch individual sheep.
Yeah, so thank you very much again, Laura, and thank you much for everyone attending. Good
Okay,
night.
thank you. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you.